Welcome to 503 Assessment in Reading Instruction. I am Beth Walsh-Moorman. I'm going to be your instructor for this course. A little bit of background about me. I come to higher education after 20-some years in the high school classroom. My area of interest, I did a curriculum in instruction, doctorate from Kent State University, and my area of interest is in literacy. And so I'm really excited to be sharing this course with you. I think that, there's a lot that we can unwrap. There's even some practices I think that you're going to find that you're doing in your own classrooms that maybe this course will help you to kind of refine those practices and maybe understand a little bit of even the why behind what you're doing. I think a lot of times when it comes to assessment, especially reading assessments, we like to focus the teachers on, the teacher training on how to do the assessments, but we want to spend a little bit more time in this class on the why. All right, so the objective of the course is to learn a wide range of assessment tools and practices so that we can create and begin to really provide strong measurement data for both individuals and groups. I think that's important that we recognize the need to do both. The final assessment for this course is going to be looking at your ability to create an individual report for one student, but also I think that it's important that we understand that part of what we're doing is being able to look at things like program-wide assessments as well. All right, I did ask that you watch the ODE video on the simple view of reading. I think this is a really important, it complements what we're doing in the classroom, but Ohio has chosen this, has adopted this model as their view for reading. And everything in the plan to raise literacy achievement is really predicated and uses the simple view of reading. So as much as possible, I'm going to be integrating the simple view of reading into the course. I think you're going to see when we talk about the simple view of reading comprehension being decoding and language comprehension, you're going to see that really what we're going to be looking at in this course are assessments that can help us to look at decoding skills, look at language comprehension skills, so that we can figure out when our students are not able to comprehend to our expectations. We can start to figure out maybe a little bit about what's going on there. So what I would like to do today is, since you have the simple view of reading, I kind of want to talk a little bit about how we got to where we're at, a little bit of the history, and then we'll move from there. So, hopefully just give you some of the key terms for big ideas that you'll use throughout the semester. Okay, so when it comes to in terms of our current understanding, when we think of simple view of reading as a current understanding of reading and comprehension, let's kind of do a little bit about how we got here, how we got into where we're at. And it's really the 20th century is really where we start to kind of pull our roots to what's happening in today's classroom. It really goes to my man John Dewey, who I know most of you probably are familiar with, but really John Dewey and the progressives were the ones that looked at student growth models for education. Prior to that, education was really just something that we did for two things. We wanted to prepare people to participate in organized religion, and we wanted them to be able to participate in social political life. So the literacy needs at that point were like, can people read a property deed? Can they, cast a vote? And John Dewey was somebody who really kind of brought us to this idea that we really want to prepare for personal achievement and growth. And so really it's John Dewey and his work in his schools that got us into this idea of comprehension as a very complex act of meaning making between texts and learning as inquiry. So it has a lot of John Dewey was really talking about this idea of Vision Schools, a system that was designed to foster independent, student-centered thinking. And that really has large implications on reading pedagogy, because reading is often, until that point, reading was just seen as this very passive act. And now John Dewey got us to think, no, really we need to engage and make this a personal act of meaning making. Developmentalists that were around the same time as John Dewey, they really looked at patterns of growth for children, and they were identifying this. They identified this idea that we see while it is a personal, process, we see sort of trends within students. And so they discovered that there are stages of development, and that the stages were kind of recursive. That means that they built on each other. So the the understanding of letters and letter sounds built to an understanding of words, words built to an understanding of sentences. And so the developmentalists really started to shift our idea into this idea of stages. And being able to identify, like, maybe why what stage a student might be in when we have students that are achieving and learning at different levels and at different rates. So, okay. So then we move into, from the developmental learners, we start to look at psychology and reading. And psychology and reading, our understanding of reading really was designed by psychologists rather than by education experts, which is interesting. Psychologists really became deeply, deeply interested in the process of reading, and they would do things like they would study eye movement and look to see where our eye movement, what field our eye movements dominated, and they started to look at reading as sort of a vitally important cognitive process, under a thinking process, if you will. So when we started to see things like the psychology and the pedagogy of reading by Edmund Berkey Huey in the early 1900s, we began to think of reading as a cognitive process. So the psychologists really helped us to understand. And part of the reason the psychologists were able to really help us understand this as a cognitive process with multiple steps and recursive skills was the advent of the standardized tests, which really came into view by the 1910s. We were seeing versions of the Binet's IQ test, right? And so this helped us, like the standardization. Really, the IQ test was really designed to assess recruits. This was during World War I and World War II. We had like 2 million recruits that they need to process and assess very quickly, and so the standardized test gave them a way to do that. But what it brought to us is this idea of a multiple choice question that can easily be scored. And it was something that then, and actually it came from the state of Kansas, was the one that had for a silent reading test. But it really, it helps us to look efficiently at this idea of achievement. So, okay. So then we move to our, let me show you. Okay, here's an item from the Thurston's intelligence test. Leanne Thurston was considered a pioneer in intelligence testing. So you can just get a sense. These are the types of things that, these are the predecessors to our standardized tests. I mean, when you think about your students taking their state tests, these were the predecessors. These are the grandma and grandpas of that time, right? Okay. So also at this time, we really started to put an emphasis, the multiple choice questions and the local assessments really started to look at this idea that being able to recall something equaled being able to comprehend it. So early studies, early tests asked our students to recall relevant words or ideas after silent reading. Time testing was designed to measure the speed at which they could complete that task. And there was this belief that the quicker they could recall, the better their comprehension, and boom. So it was a much more simple, when you think about the video that you watched from ODE about the simple view of reading, well, it's not really that simple. And this was a far simpler. If I can recall it, I comprehended it, right? We did start to look at, this idea of silent reading and the importance of silent reading. And so early research into it looked at structure, content, and reader mindset as sort of the most important elements to successful silent reading. But what is important is that the silent reading, there started to move to an emphasis on meaning making as an act of reading, and it established this idea, and this is a pedagogical objective for us as reading teachers. And so while we maybe don't necessarily want to use basal readers like we used at the time, in the 30s and 40s when the basal readers were becoming more popular, at least they were helping us to understand that silent reading, the act of having rather than just straight out recitation, the act of having a student, make meaning on their own, that those were important. So they also, up until the 20s and 30s, there was this idea that reading was a habit. But it was Thorndike, Edward R. Thorndike, who's like, no, it's not just a habit. It's not just like, it's not like something like, running could be a habit, running form. You can learn running form, and that can become a habit that you learn through practice. And Thorndike was like, no, there's more to that. It is many elements. It includes structure. Students need some understanding of the structure, they need some understanding of the content, and they need to come to it with the right mindset. And so Thorndike really was starting to create this idea of reading as a complex and a personal process. And so we started to understand that maybe silent reading was superior to oral reading, because up until then there was a lot of recitation, right? As a whole group, let's read this poem together. And so there started to be an emphasis on silent reading, so that we can get the thoughts of the writer. The job of the reader is to get the thought of the writer that the writer is trying to express. And so this was, an important time when we were really starting to understand reading as a personal act, and to move away from this idea of whole class recitation and memorization, and really look at silent reading as sort of the act of cognition that we now recognize it as. So, the 30s and 40s and the invention of scanners and computers. I mean, we talk about the modern computer. I know it looked nothing like the modern computer today, but what that did was it reduced the cost of standardized testing and scoring it, so that this was not just something that was happening in the military, and by the federal government. We started to see the emergence of the SAT tests. They had been written tests, but now they were machine scoreable tests with multiple choice. So we started to develop new generation reading tests that were created in this format using, multiple choice and an optical scanner. The focusing was on key skills that they believed were critical to comprehension, things like word knowledge, reasoning about reading. And so we started to have this idea of statistical analysis, and we started to hear about things like stanines and percentile ranks and things like that. And so what we see is a 1971 study of the Iowa Test of Basic Skills found that some skills were statistically independent: listening comprehension, verbal reasoning, reading and skimming scores, while others were not, like paragraph meaning, cause and effect, reading for inference, and selecting main ideas. And so we started to look at so they started to be able to recognize that there's some skills that you can, I can test vocabulary in isolation, but I can't test something like and I can test speed of reading in isolation, but the understanding of cause and effect, that's not a skill that I can test in isolation. They started to recognize that there are some things, some limitations to the scoring and the statistical analysis that you can get out of the scoring of a standardized test, which is important because it really brought us to kind of understand that we need to, in reading, we might want to consider some other ways to test for reading. And so we started to develop things like maybe the close test, which is a test where you give students, you test their comprehension, and you give them, you strategically take out words that you want to see if they're able to put in words that keep the meaning of the passage, things like that. And so this is it's also scoreable, but it was, it was a test designed to be able to get to those skills that maybe a standardized test wasn't able to discretely measure, like being able to look for cause and effect as a skill. And so, some of what we recognize even as early as the 1950s is that these standardized tests had limitations. And that's why you see things like the open response, the constructed responses. The state tests are you're very familiar with those, but you see the constructed responses, short answers, things like that. You see them looking for different ways to score because what we recognize is that this was a very, very challenging process. Reading there's so many interrelated components to reading to be able to really assess it and figure out what's going on, why a student isn't. One thing to understand why a student doesn't know a vocabulary word, that was something that could be measured. But why can't they follow the cause and effect or synthesize two ideas? That's a little bit more complex, and it requires different types of assessments to get us there. Okay, so what that moved us to is cognitive theories of education, which really took root in our lifetimes. I would say by the 1980s, we were really starting to understand learning as a very complex cognitive process. Reading educators began to understand the notion of background knowledge and the importance of background knowledge, and they started to look at, the role of the individual in creating the meaning. So they started to ask questions like cultural bias and the impact of assessment data on implicit bias, maybe starting to ask about achievement gaps between white and minority students. So by 1980s, we're really kind of moving to a constructive approach to reading that really looked at this idea of what is the process by which we individually make meaning, and inquiry and the inquiry process that we do as we try to comprehend a text, and really looking at like maybe social factors and things like that may draw into it. And so now we started to have assessments that address questions of prior knowledge that maybe offer things like environmental clues, and that allow the student to really emerge as the meaning maker. And so we have longer passages in our tests, we have more challenging questions, we have different question formats such as more than one correct answer. Our testing begins to use more authentic tests. Some of these reforms are not even visible for the teacher. Testing companies developed elaborate processes in the hopes of addressing perceived deficits in testing, and so the teachers themselves kind of maybe didn't even realize the shifts that were happening in the 40s or in the 80s for standardized testing in reading comprehension. We also started to look at comprehension tests that were designed to better address comprehension from a cognitive and a constructivist view. So here's an example of something from the 1970s. So examinees were given a sentence and asked to select an appropriate paraphrase. Each answer option included an appropriate paraphrase of the sentence with some semantic substitutes changing the meaning. And so students then had to figure out, we were trying to see whether or not students were able to keep the meaning but change the phrasing of the sentence. So, we also started to see classroom assessments emerge as really, really important. Really, they weren't that important up until the 1980s. That's when you started to see focus on retelling as an important tool for assessing comprehension. We started to talk about think aloud protocols that would allow us to understand what a student's process was. We started to include things like write-along tasks that might allow your assessors to see a student's thought process as they take mandatory notes through their reading. We also started to look at fluency testing and informal reading inventories that would allow us to get a better picture of the different parts of reading, so that we can understand what might be happening with a struggling reader. So really, it was the 1980s and beyond that brought us the modern era of testing. That really is the era that this course is placed in. Okay, so let's just talk a little bit about some of the important ideas that we need to think about. Just a real quick primer of some words that I want to make sure that we're all familiar with and we're all using the same meanings, okay? First thing I want to talk about is a deficit versus a contextual model. Deficit models are outdated, and this class is not going to be, I get very upset when I feel like I'm kind of contributing to a deficit model. A deficit model is this idea that a difficulty or if a student comes to you with a reading difficulty, that reading difficulty resides within that student. There's something wrong with that student, and the teacher has to identify what's wrong with that student and then has to respond to it. We are going to be looking through a more contextual approach, which admits that a student may have a deficit, but it asks us to broaden our perspective and to look at instructional practices. Are we teaching in a way that's appropriate for the child? Maybe we want to now address socioeconomic concerns. Did the child have breakfast, for instance, before the child came into our classroom to take a test? It allows for questions of learning styles. It looks for things like cultural responsive pedagogy. It looks, to see if there's what role other concerns might have in, a lot of the Common Core has been looking at like exposure to informational texts and different text genres. So the contextual model doesn't just look at the child. The contextual model also has us looking at ourselves, our practices, school as an institution, and sort of trying to explore that. Okay. Importantly, though, what most contextual models seek to understand is a child's development and maybe how some of those other factors might be influencing the child's development. So there are several stages models that have been used to develop the assessments that we use. So when you talk about things like grade level reading, those grade level readings are being developed through the use of stage models. This is a picture of Jean Chall's model of reading development. This is probably the most famous model for reading development. But there are certainly others that the different programs, so if you are measuring your students through STAR or Scholastic, they're coming to those grade level estimates based on their understanding of these different models and stages of reading development. And so it's important to understand that the stages also help us not just identify what a student can't do, but what a student is capable of doing. And so when we think about the deficit model versus the contextual model, if we find a student that maybe has a reading gap, understanding what they can do and what stage they're at will help us to move them along so that we can build on the things that they can do. So that's really important for us to remember as we're looking at this in stages. Here's another example of a stage model. This is a stage model for discrete skills, particularly in this one. This is discrete skills in reading. So you can see that it seeks to demonstrate the relationship between skills such as like phonemic awareness, word recognition, and strategic reading. And it looks how skill gaps in the lower level limits a student's ability to become highly proficient in the upper level. So when you think about the simple view of reading, really is looking at this in terms of stages. It maybe isn't as sequential as this model here is, right? The stage model. But what it is recognizing is that if something got missed in a stage, then it's, we're not going to be able to get to true comprehension. So, all right. So here's another stage model for spelling by Beer, and it was looking at, early spelling stages so that a teacher can understand when it's appropriate to start to begin to expect a student to be able to spell correctly. And so all of these really are building up to this idea of a cognitive model, which is that reading is composed of three separate components: automatic word recognition, comprehension of the language and the text, and the ability to use strategies and to seek out strategies that help the reader achieve their purpose in the text. So if it's reading for pleasure, they're going to use different strategies than if it's reading to learn something new, or if it's reading to review something. These are all strategies. So that's when you talk about the self-monitoring strategies that students develop. So when you put all this together, what this helps you understand is that if a reading problem is suspected, if you've identified that there is in fact a gap, you're really acting as a detective. There's a lot that you're going to need to look at, and you need to consider things like emotional issues, difficulty testing. You need to think about contextual problems. You need to think about your own instructional context, and so it's as simple as giving a test and getting a number. Wish it was, but it isn't, and that's something that's really important for us to consider. Okay, all right, so ultimately we need to consider this idea of what is needed for comprehension, and that's where you're going to see a lot of the focus in the class. We know that comprehension, in order for comprehension to occur, we need automatic word recognition. And so those are all of the decoding skills that are so important, right? We know that context, we need to be able to understand the passage. This is kind of, are students able to understand the purpose? Are they able to identify the tone? Things like that. And they need to be able to monitor their own reading. They need to be able to kind of rapidly self-assess and understand whether or not, like, let's say they find something that has, two possible meanings. I found the solution. The solution could be, the solution to the problem, or I found the solution like this thing in the lab that has, two liquids that have been together. And so the student needs to be able to personally monitor and figure out very quickly, it's not just about decoding the word solution, but then they have to monitor and figure out very quickly what the appropriate use of that is. So another thing that we want to consider here is why assessments are so important is there's this thing called the Matthew effect. Struggling readers fall behind because we keep them on the lower level skills and they don't develop those upper level skills. And so as a assessor, the more direct we can be, the more specific we can be, the better we're going to do. We're going to do it figuring out the patterns and the problems and being able to get them to move into the higher order skills. And we also want to consider ways that we can check their higher order skills, because you'd be surprised. In fact, one of the activities that we do in this class, people often comment that they were surprised at how much the student understood about the passage, given that they were clearly having some issues with decoding. And so we want to be able to identify ways that we can continue to practice their inference skills or their cause and effect, their ability to identify cause and effect, even if they're still having problems on, phonemic awareness or some of the decoding issues. Because that gap does not necessarily mean that the student doesn't have potential in the higher level skills. And so we want to be able to be aware of that. Okay, so what are some terms I want you to know? I want you to know group versus individual tests. Individual, or one of the things we can know, that individual tests might require oral responses if you're talking about adaptive testing for some of your students, but individual tests. We want to know what a formal versus an informal test. Informal test is when a teacher has some latitude to interpret the results in the testing method. And so, a lot of what we do as teachers is informal testing. The formal testing are things like the state tests, where there's little discretion for the teacher, right? I think that's part of why we don't like the state tests. Norm reference versus criterion reference. Norms is how the child performed in comparison with others. And so that's when you see things like percentile ranks, stay-nines, and grade equivalents. Criterion or benchmark testing is when a student passes a certain amount. And so, the STARS test, that's a norm reference test. That's where you get a grade level equivalent. The state of Ohio's end of course exams or their state tests, those are all criterion, right? There's a certain percentage that the students have to pass to be considered proficient. Okay, so what are stay-nines? Stay-nines are a little bit different to understand. Percentiles are easier, right? If somebody is in the 85th percentile, that means that they scored better than 85% of the students that took that test. Like, that's something easier. But when we get a report that reports out a student's stay-nine, that becomes hard, right? Because there's a whole bunch of statistical analysis that's going behind the stay-nines. But while stay-nines are not as specific as percentiles, they divide our students into statistically equivalent categories, which means that it takes a lot more effort to move from the first stay-nine to the second stay-nine to the third. So essentially think about it this way. If I scored the 83rd percentile, and my neighbor scored an 85th percentile. That may not be statistically different. We may essentially be achieving it at the same level, even though there's a two percentile rank difference. So we can end up in the same STAI-9, because the STAI-9 then just kind of takes and looks at the statistically significant scores and groups them together. And so you get a better sense of your student in terms of your student in relation to the group as a whole. So that's what we want to consider. And so grade equivalent scores, which is something that that we also want to consider in our classrooms. It's probably the most problematic score that we have, which is kind of difficult because we use it so often in the literacy classrooms. But it's not using it talks about grade equivalency, and we go all the way to college ready, but statistically we have some problems because we don't actually have a college student who's reading like in a fifth grade passage to be able to then kind of rate your fifth grade students' performance to theirs. So, it uses the stages, and it's a best guess, but just do know that those are, and that's why you probably have seen if you're using more than one program, you might wonder why somebody is coming up with a different grade equivalent score in one program of another. Okay, so the other thing we want to know is whether or not a test is reliable. We want to consider the reliability, which means that there needs to be consistency of results. A lot of teacher-made tests, we might have some problems with reliability. Some of our low-achieving students might do really well on a test, or our high-achieving students might not. We want to consider why that might be. So we really want to work towards reliability, which means that scores are consistent. We also want to talk about validity. We want to make sure that, like, if I'm teaching giving a comprehension assessment, I want to make sure that that's really what is being measured, and does it reflect the curriculum that's taught? Is it valid? So that that particular comprehension quest, the student might not have understood it because maybe there was a vocabulary word that they didn't understand, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they didn't comprehend the text as a whole. And so I want to be able to consider that validity. Okay. All right. So this is, just kind of an introduction, and the ODE Simple View of Reading is another introduction. Please refer to the syllabus and to Leo to get your assignments for the rest of the week, but we will be having these very quick video lectures throughout the course. So thank you, and I will see you next week.